The room was dim, lit only by the soft glow of a single nightlight. Jacob lay in bed, his small hands tracing shapes in the air as the shadows danced on the wall. His mother had taught him how to make a rabbit, a dog, even a bird. But tonight, Jacob was bored of the usual forms. Tonight, he wanted to create something new, something special. He shaped his fingers into a new creature, one with long, spindly arms and a sharp, angular head. It didn't look like anything he had seen before, but that's what made it exciting. As he moved his hands, the shadow shifted and twisted on the wall, growing more defined with each flick of his wrist. Then, something strange happened. The shadow twitched, just for a moment, as if it had a life of its own. Jacob paused, staring at the wall, heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. He moved his fingers again, and this time, the shadow didn't just follow his movements. It anticipated them. "Whoa," Jacob whispered, his breath fogging in the cold night air. The shadow grew larger, its form stretching and warping until it no longer fit the shape of his hands. It slithered down the wall, a dark, inky mass that seemed to pulse with a life all its own. Jacob's eyes widened. Can you do something?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. The shadow froze, then its head slowly turned toward him. It nodded. Jacob's heart leaped in his chest. He had made something real, something that listened to him. "Make the toys dance," he commanded, pointing to the collection of action figures lined up on his dresser. The shadow didn't move at first, but then it flowed across the room like spilled ink, wrapping around the base of the figures. One by one, they began to move, their stiff limbs jerking to life as if pulled by invisible strings. They danced in a macabre parade, their eyes dull and lifeless as they twisted and spun in grotesque motions. Jacob giggled, clapping his hands. "Do it again!" But the shadow didn't stop. It grew darker, thicker, and the toys' movements became more erratic, their limbs snapping and twisting in unnatural angles. A sickening crack echoed through the room as one figure's arm snapped clean off, dangling by a thin string of plastic. Jacob's smile faltered. "Stop," he said, a hint of unease creeping into his voice. The shadow paused, but the toys didn't. They continued their twisted dance, their movements growing more violent, more frenzied. One figure smashed its head against the dresser, again and again, until it shattered into pieces. Another bent backward, its spine snapping with a loud, sickening pop. "I said stop!" Jacob screamed, but the shadow only seemed to grow stronger, feeding off his fear. It slithered up the walls, consuming the light, and the room plunged into darkness. Jacob scrambled back against the headboard, his tiny hands clutching the sheets as the shadow loomed over him. Its form was no longer a simple puppet. It had grown into something monstrous, something malevolent. Its eyes, once hollow and empty, now glowed with a sinister red light. Jacob tried to scream, but his voice caught in his throat. The shadow reached out, its long, spindly fingers wrapping around his wrist. It felt cold, colder than anything he had ever felt. And where it touched, his skin began to wither and blacken, like a flower caught in frost. "No!" Jacob cried, struggling to pull away, but the shadow tightened its grip, dragging him off the bed and onto the floor. His skin burned where it touched him, a searing pain that shot through his body like fire. He could feel it spreading, the darkness creeping up his arm, turning his flesh into a twisted, blackened mass. "Please," he begged, tears streaming down his face, but the shadow didn't stop. It dragged him closer, pulling him into its dark embrace, until his entire body was consumed by the blackness. The last thing Jacob saw was the glowing red eyes of the creature he had created, staring down at him with a hunger that could never be sated. And then, there was nothing but darkness. The next morning, Jacob's mother found his room empty. The bed was cold, the toys scattered in pieces on the floor. But there was no sign of Jacob. Only a single shadow lingered on the wall, its form twisted and grotesque, with glowing red eyes that watched her as she screamed his name in vain. The shadow puppets had a new master now, and they would not rest until they had fed on more than just a child's innocent dreams.